Welcome everyone to the first of our faculty speakers in this semester's seminar series. I would like first to acknowledge that UBC's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you are probably joining us today from many places near and far. And so too to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Fausto Sarmiento. He is Professor of Mountain Science in the Geography Department at University of Georgia. He's also an affiliate faculty member of their School of Ecology. And prior to that role, he was co-director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies there. I would say that these roles really nicely sum up Professor Sarmiento's kind of social ecological reach into the human ecological worlds of mountains in the global south and north. And earlier I realized, I was just saying to him that he was recommended to me by Stephen Chignell, but I had realized then that I had read a few of his completely novel early papers. One of these was on anthropogenic influences on the assumed origins of tree lines in the Andean cloud forests. And I'd say since then he's taken that work to a whole other level about which I'll speak today. But I also want to say when speaking with Steve about Fausto's work, we were also both really taken by, excuse me, his ability to look closely at language and cognition. And as Steve also rightly said, his ability to transgress disciplinary boundaries and to approach what we would normally call, critical scholarship in a highly positive, even infectious kind of way that's frankly really important, not just to academia, but beyond. So welcome, Fausto. I will turn the mic over to you and you can share the screen anytime.
Yes, perfect. First of all, let me thank the opportunity to share with you my thoughts. When I received this very cordial invitation, I couldn't say no, particularly because I had just been in contact with a student who is a very bright scholar in the mountains of Ethiopia, that we had a very interesting conversation about what the challenges for mythology is, not only in the United States or in Canada, but all over the world. So I was very glad to find that that little conversation resonated and that actually resulted in IRES invited me to speak to you. I am going to share my screen. I will actually present my thoughts based on these beautiful vistas of the several mountains in the tropical Andes. I've been talking about socio-ecological systems, and mountains are by definition a socio-ecological system, but are just now being realized. And so the idea is that I will actually continue presenting this information about the socio-ecological system in mountainscapes through these different headings. I definitely would like very much for you to follow my philosophical reasoning for calling mythology the next frontier that we have for mountain studies. So the epigraph that we definitely get inspired is one that was actually published as an opus posthum by François-René de Chateaubriand. Forests precede civilizations, deserts follow them. My idea was that Chateaubriand left something there because according to the recent studies, we realized that everything in the planet, including human societies, somehow are pulsing. They have a cyclical etiology, something that in the Andes, the Quichua nation call it Pachacutic. Everything comes and goes through time. And so this is a very interesting conversation because what we are doing now to our planet will have to come back sooner or later. Science in mountains have actually been always taken by the idea of the physical geography side, particularly because the reductionistic approach, the deterministic way in which the scientific method was presented to the Western world, with René Descartes, followed also with this genius of Isaac Newton, developing this notion of the dialectic, the forces that are counteracting to explain mechanistically how the planet is actually working. The inclusion of mathematics and the reliance on calculus in order to get the response or the resolution of problems in the world. Imagine what would happen if instead of following Descartes or Newton, we had the opportunity to follow Baruch Spinoza, where the rational criticism was born. Holism was the way of developing this opportunity to integrate this knowledge as one. And of course, instead of determinism, possibilism was possible, meaning give humans the agency needed in order to explain what we have now in front of us, something that we call nature. I wanted to emphasize the fact that the natural history collections from Pedro Franco Davila, a person who was born in what is now Guayaquil, served to found the Royal Cabinet of Natural History in Madrid, whose exhibits fed expeditionary impetus of scientists, explorers, and Europeans adventurers into the New World. This means that not only science had been given to us from this reductionistic positivism approach, but it was somehow a kind of a colonial legacy implemented by this thirst of knowledge of the expeditionaries and adventurers and explorers coming to America, as if this was an unknown world. One of the first one who did that, particularly a French scientist, part of the French geodesic mission, Charles-Marie de la Condamine, along with Pedro Vicente Maldonado, who was a local scientist that helped him navigate all of the difficulties of field work, measuring the meridian of the arc in Ecuador. So the calculation for finding the appropriate shape of the planet came about with that. So La Condamine emphasized the site characterization as a geographical approach to understand the landscape, including metrics, catalogs, and taxonomy. Of course, he was in favor of haptic naturalism, something that now people actually insist is that something that can be measured is real. And so if we cannot measure something, we shouldn't be bothering about with science. So that particular view has been now modified with something that the Japanese culture knows very well as Suito Gaku. And Suito Gaku is actually this fusing of the different worlds in which we live. The natural world, like somehow framing as a scenery, the human world, somehow framed as this interactive agency, and also the spiritual world that put together these in these symbolic values, religious values, and the conservation value that the Suito Gaku has actually approached. Scientifically, this idea of spheres that are intersecting can be considered to be precisely this Venn diagram that shows the humanities in one side, the physical sciences on a different side, and of course the social sciences, and how they integrate themselves in what is now known as transdisciplinary approach. A good example of a transdisciplinary approach that you can see in the scheme presented, the presses and pulses that you can find in mountain ecosystems in different scales like global, regional, or local, incorporating all of those ecosystem services that are floating down the mountains towards the lowlands, including not only these physical properties, but also the social characteristics. Therefore, we are now talking about the transdisciplinary science of ontology. And the good example that I came out with is presenting you a disciplinary emphasis of genetics, for instance. Then you combine other disciplines and you have genomatics, and see genomatics incorporate 2 or even 3 disciplines. But then if you fuse them all and incorporate other, you have interdisciplinary science, and you consider the idea of microrefugium planning. So not just the genomics or genomatics is actually incorporated in it, but also biogeography, conservation ecology, and so forth. Now, the transdisciplinary approach is given by ontology, by which you just not integrate what is intersecting between the spheres, but somehow you are cross-cutting the spheres and incorporate the whole of the phenomenon there. As you realize in the graphic, a key for geographical studies, particularly mountains, is the scale. And we have to scale in disciplinarity as well. So from the multidisciplinary approach, in which we have juxtaposition, sequentiation, and coordination, we go to the interdisciplinary level, in which we understand to integrate, to interact, to connect, focus, and combine the disciplines, and then ended up in the transdisciplinary level, where regenerative co-creation exists, along with transcendence, transgression, translation, and transformation. This is precisely the kind of science that we need to better understand mountains. So we have gone from less to more in the complementation, the integration, and also the collaboration of the several scientific and humanistic disciplines to understand mountain landscapes. But it's not actually individually connected through these jumps in the hierarchy or scale. If you consider these processes acting like a clock, is a mechanism that is continuously working. It is not necessarily to jump from one to the other. You can actually come back from the other to the one, but the idea is that this is a continued process that makes the progression of science possible. Ontology requires that we definitely use literacy, refer to how we get to know the world, particularly the geoliteracy, the ecoliteracy, and the sopholiteracy. These are the 3 main components of our understanding of the mountain landscapes, where we are required to be critical in, we have to be critical of, and we have to be critical through. This is precisely this innovative congruence of the several disciplines that allows us to envision this new way of getting to know the mountain systems. Remember that we consider mountains as sentient landscapes. Mountology, therefore, is a noetic science of mountains. In mountains, there should be consilience. Please pay attention to these very important 3 buzzwords that are now being used as key words for ontology: sentient, noetic, and consilience. That's precisely the basis for our understanding that mountains should be reflected in the pluriverse. They are not located in a universe. They are actually elements of a pluriverse. Also, ontology is the transdisciplinary science of mountains. Ontology is the convergence and integrity study of mountains. Mountains are socioecological production landscapes, and ontology translates the ecological legacies of mountainscapes. Mountains, therefore, are biocultural heritage territories that we need to protect, conserve, but most of all, regenerate. And that's something that ontology is now contributing to the discourse of the new narrative of conservation. We just don't need to aim to sustainable development. Sustainability per se can never be achieved. Sustainability should be linked intrinsically with regenerative development. So if we continue maintaining the system for perpetuity in a sustainable way, that is not natural. nothing works that way in nature. So what we have to recreate, we have to give the opportunity to bring back the functions that had been senescent for a while, or that had been destroyed by humanity. So the idea is that mythology contribute to this very interesting approach, considering not only sustainable development, but also regenerative development in mountains. For that, I always go back to the basics. And so the glossaries, the dictionaries, the encyclopedias about mountains, all of those sources that allow us to understand this terminology is quite important, particularly now when we are talking the possibility of life in a post-growth conservation era. We have these principles that have been presented by Fletcher et al. As a new frontier for conservation. And first and foremost is conviviality. The second is very important, biocultural diversity. Therefore, we incorporate these new factors such as decommodification, revaluing the sacred in nature, decolonizing. We have social justice, redistribution, subsidiarity, global connections, aligning conservation and resistance, and redefining power. These principles may sound a little bit leftist or maybe gendered in Marxist geography, but they are actually an imperative, particularly in the global South, where knowledge has been generated also from other forms of scholarship. So Western science, along with Eastern science or local science, incorporating this ancestral knowledge, is the opportunity to provide options for conviviality, to maintain biocultural diversity, and to decommodify the ecosystem services that are now in vogue. So these themes and concepts make a very clear statement that in order to understand mountain systems, we have to deal with fusing the natural and the cultural systems along with the social system. And this is done throughout this cycle of resilience that you must be familiar with, changing from R to K in the ecological terminology. And this is the repetition. I told you in the Andes, people call this pachacutic. Everything's go back in cycles and continue moving forward. That is the interplay in the mountain landscapes that we find nested ecological hierarchies. But then when we incorporate the social systems and the adaptive change, we end up having non-nested panarchies that have to be managed appropriately with our science that we have available. What is that? Geography, of course. Some people call geography the environmental science par excellence. Some actually suggested that geography and natural history gave birth to ecology. And some of them have pointed to Alexander von Humboldt to be the father of ecology. However, Alexander von Humboldt did not do that alone, particularly in his about maybe 6 months traveling in the mountains of Ecuador. Local scientists helped him a lot. And Juan Pío Montúfar has to be mentioned because Alexander von Humboldt could have not reached the Chimborazo volcano that he rightly described if it were not for the help that he obtained from the local scholars at the time. So when Cosmos was published after all of this realization of Alexander von Humboldt in the Americas, we realized that everything was connected with everything else. So ecology was born, but not just that. Humboldt is also considered to be the father of magnetism, volcanology, biogeography. Now we consider him the father of climate change and ethnobiology. But really the recognition of Humboldt as father of mythology, or what was named before geoecology, allow us to question that the invention of nature responds mostly by the work that he did in presenting these ideas of cosmos. So Nature is something that we invented. Um, Current scholarship in the new narrative of political ecology consider nature a social construct. And this is something that we could actually have a lot of examples presented, not just in the tropical Andes, such as my studies have demonstrated, but throughout the world. Mountains of the World was actually published in 1997, presented a global priority. However, the editors, Bruno Mesoli and Jack Ives, were very good in stimulating conversation that brought this global topic into the local scenarios. So I was asked to contribute with this process by producing the book in Spanish about the mountains of the world, with a very interesting innovation, which was presenting a global priority, but with a Latin American perspective. And there we mentioned the need of redefining how we study mountains, because geography now is very much into the idea of the three-dimensional space. Technology allowed us to do some geospatial analysis, to have computer power to geo-visualize what we have over there in nature. But in reality, we have to recognize that X, Y, and Z dimensions can be manipulated in such a way that the fourth dimension is still the one that drives the geographical studies. This was commented already long ago by the father of American geography, Carl Sauer, who introduced this notion of historicity instead of time. So the fourth dimension that we use to analyze the environment is time, but time per se is worthless. What really matters in our understanding is all of what happened politically, socially, during this period of time that we are analyzing. So nowadays in ontology, we like to emphasize historicity as the driving factor to explain the things that we have in the landscape. Also, the spatiality is not just the X and Y and Z, including the verticality of mountains, what is important, but also to understand how those three factors have been transformed with the historicity of the place, in that the landscape had been converted in something new. Particularly in the Andes, in the tropical Andes where I work, examples have come repeatedly, and it is very interesting to demonstrate the fact that ecological legacies are those used to answer these questions that have come from ecology and from geography. Ecology per se have actually changed. These changing models are very important for us to understand that in the past, ecology, looking to succession theory with Clements, individual fitness with Gleason, they emphasize a lot of the ideas of interacting biomes, trying to find a structure and order in the ecosystems. They thought that ecology works observing laws and rules, and they believe that everything should be explained with experimentation and mapping. The final goal of science in ecology of that time was to provide generalizations. So the emphasis was placed on ecosystems, such as you see here in the Spanish language textbook that Professor Eugene Odum and I put together. This is a very important condition for understanding how today ecology has morphed. We don't use the term ecosystem anymore. We use the term landscape, because we have incorporated ideas about biodiversity from Wilson, the notions of non-equilibrium for Botkin, including a lot of bioenergetics, particularly the factors of entropy. We are biased, but finding patterns, particularly landscape ecology, is actually based on finding patterns. We analyze how the different spheres are interacting, particularly how they flow together in obtaining what they call at the time homeostasis or equilibrium. A lot of effort was placed in geospatial analysis, where GIS was incorporated into the toolbox of geographers and conservationists. And finally, the notion of domains and specialization of people who study nature. That is the ecology today. What about the ecology of the future? Ecology of the future requires us to have an integrative view, requires a noetic science, require considering the systems there as sentient ecosystems. So in other words, the ecology of tomorrow requires ontology, because we are dealing with manufactured landscapes. We have hybrid territories, and we are dealing with productive socio-ecological mountainscapes. I don't know if you agree or not with the idea of the Anthropocene, but in reality, if we don't incorporate these areas with this integrative, transdisciplinary approach of ontology, we will never get to understand mountains very well. That's the reason why we need a shift in the paradigms of mountains. You see here on the left, the idea of a mountain as seen and profiled by Alexander von Humboldt on the Chimborazo volcano. The idea was completely descriptive, reductionistic, morphological, homeostatic. And so nowadays, with the help of this ontological approach, we have an about face of the scientific approach for mountains. And we go rather to the analytic instead of the descriptive. We are going to the homeoretic instead of the homeostatic. We are actually going to the convergent instead of the divergent, and so on and so forth. So this is my invitation for you to consider how important it is to assume the fact that we have to revisit what we have learned about landscape, what we have learned about mountains in the past. We are actually called to break the mountain paradigms. We definitely need to incorporate the notion that human impacts have helped manage the Tropandian landscape. Please note how I have written the term manage. It's not management, but it's man-agement. And that's precisely what we see in these ancient landscapes. Resilience is now the tour de force for socio-ecological studies. And this diagram allows us to understand that we cannot separate the natural systems from the cultural systems. Whether we are looking into the vulnerability of an area, or we are searching for the different adaptation processes that are required in order to cope with the destabilizing process such as the climate change, we definitely have to incorporate, the decision-making and the innovation in bringing the system back to a stable form. And that has to be done not only in areas where nature dominates, but in areas where culture dominates. And that is how I have placed in opposite corners mountainscapes in one side and cityscapes in another side. So both complexes are actually coupled, complex adaptive systems. But now with the realization that they are socio-ecological productive landscapes and seascapes, we are compelled into bringing this new understanding. New understanding in mountain landscapes that include, for instance, recognize the different identity that the people who live in these places have. I have posited the notion of finding these three factors for the Andean identity. In Quechua, they are called Yanantin, or the complementary dualism, where you analyze an attribute and find the antipode. So black and white, good or bad. The other is the Massintin, and this is a very dynamic behavioral resonance and dynamism in which you actually compare with the energy level that you place into whatever you are studying, such as a passive way or an active way. And finally, the Tawantin, this is actually considered to be a comprehensive well-being, that you go from the individual to the collective. And as you intersect all of these factors, you find the fact that the trilemma kicks in, because we don't have only dual opposites. There's always something more, a third component that incorporates this notion of aini, which can be translated as reciprocity, with the three commandments of the Incas, Amaquilla, Amashua, and Amaluya. Those terms actually guide our understanding for what we can consider to be the physical, quantifiable, and measurable attributes we call Andianity. We also have to understand the induce and conceive from sociocultural attributes. We call that Andianness. And then we call the subducted and infer from mental imaginaries the Andianitude. This is precisely the depth at which mythology challenges us in our understanding of mountain systems.
5 minutes left. Sorry.
Okay, in the novel ecosystems idea, we have notions of engineering mountains, manufactured landscapes. All of that question the notion of ecosystem services. We have to decommodify nature, so instead of talking about ecosystem services, now we prefer to use the term benefits from nature to people. And that's precisely what I have suggested here in the culturally based transition from the new post-growth service economy, how the soul ecology or the sacred dimension is going to change to be a lot more important and increasing as the post-industrial economies are actually getting more affluent. So this is a very interesting perspective. The heritage and territory notion of Mount Chimborazo that is depicted here, who was the responsible to trigger all of our understanding of nature, is precisely the notion that we have to keep these areas with the knowledge generated locally and globally. We have to use mythology favoring what we understand as sustainable, but also regenerative development. I would like to conclude giving you guys a coda that is presented basically in my recent paper in the Journal of Mountain Science, is the Mythology Manifesto. My invitation for us to break old paradigms about mountains. We have to elucidate new paradoxes about mountains. We have to reconstruct myths about mountains. But most importantly, we have to regenerate the sentient mountains. We have to understand that these are living systems and we have to manage them with this kind of perspective. I think I have some time for questions from the audience.
You do indeed. Fausto, as I was saying at the beginning, first of all, thank you very much for your talk, and we can definitely open this challenge that you've laid down on the table to the floor, but we normally start with students first. So we'll take 2 questions from students first and then move on to others. Please use your hand wave function or any signaling function, and I'll try and keep an eye on questions.
I think Rocio has a question in the chat.
I see it now. Rocio, do you want me to read it out, or would you like to do that yourself? She's got unstable internet, so I'll read it for her. Gracias, Dr. Fausto, for your presentation. She says, how can ontology help us navigate the future landscape of snowless mountains, particularly tropical glaciers in the Andes? And how will not having snow, which I think is key for mountains, aesthetic features, impact the relationships local people have with their landscapes? And
that's a very good question. Yeah. Thank you, Rocio, very much. I appreciate that connection that you have with the snowy landscapes. In your part of the world, you are familiar of seeing snow-covered mountains almost all the time. And this is important. In the previous mountain literature, you will realize how scientists associate mountains with the third pole. So you have to have high altitude, you have to have a lot of snow and ice, and the new theory of mountains incorporates other views, such as, for instance, that the majority of the topographic relief that we conceive as mountains is actually in the low and middle elevation. Remember also that we have mountains under the water. There's such a magnitude of the submarine mountains that people consider Mauna Kea being the tallest mountain on Earth. And we have this very interesting challenge for us to rethink what we have learned from the past about mountains having to be glaciated and having to be covered with ice. It is actually a challenge for the future, particularly because many communities in the tropical Andes have been harvesting the water that's coming out from the glaciers. And as you already know very well, because of the increased temperature, the glaciers are retreating. There is actually a drop in the magnitude of glacier-covered mountains, such as Antisana, or even the same Chimborazo. The glaciers there have receded significantly. Remember this few years ago in Bolivia, in the Mount Chacaltaya, we were able to organize the Winter Olympics. For the first time in Latin America, the Winter Olympics were held in this facility. You know, they built a huge hotel. They actually built a huge sky lifts, trains and so forth. Now, if you visit Chacaltaya, it's like a desert. The hotel is broken out, the glasses are broken, everything is trashed out. There's no one single ice pack visible. So this is actually the front of research of many efforts, particularly from a group in the United States led by the Ohio State University researchers that look into this relation of disappearing glaciers and survivability of local population. We have been fighting the idea of drought all over the world. It's not just a matter of mountain communities. We definitely have now new sites that technologically advanced societies are dealing with desalination plants, for instance, to cope with the need of fresh water. And you can have that, for instance, in Israel now, or all of the Arab countries. They are banking on not being dependent upon the need of water elsewhere, but from the sea. And that could change. So I am not an alarmist. I am not saying that we shouldn't worry about the disappearing glaciers in the tropics. Quite the opposite. The tropical glaciers have always been the canary in the mine about global climate change. And these definitely are the culprits for this explosion in the dynamics of the rural to urban migration. Remember, Latin America, particularly these tropical Andes regions, are now the increasingly known as the primate cities of the world. 2/3 of the population of Peru live in Lima. You know, this is a very interesting realization of the fact that people change, people adapt, and I am positive that the scientists of the world have the opportunity to come with systems to provide water to these local communities. Go a little bit south, for instance, in the Atacama Desert, because of cloud stripping of the Camanchaca, the cloudiness that are coming from the sea. They have been now able to provide potable water for the people, but particularly drip irrigation for agricultural products. Most of the grapes and melons that we are using here in the United States in December, January, and February are actually exported from the previously deserted areas of northern Chile. So that's just a good example. I am always tended to think positively about the future. Maybe I am exaggerating, but it is people like you, the young generation that comes after us, who have this challenge to bring about innovation, to bring about solutions that could actually cope with these changes. I hope I answered your question, Rocio.
I understand she can't, you can always use your hand signal there, but understanding that she doesn't have stable internet. Maybe I'll move on to the next question for now. Stephen?
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Fausto, for the talk. I was wondering, it seems that a lot of your theorizing for ontology and a lot of the examples that you've given are really based, it kind of emerges from the context of the Andes. And I'm wondering if you have examples or if you have ideas about how, if and how much these conceptual frameworks apply outside of the context of the Andes, like how have people done it or have they not yet? And what about, the trilemma or any of these things are specific to the context like of the Andes, and versus how much do you see them being able, I guess it's that specific versus generalizable kind of question. But yeah, I was wondering what you see as, as how ontology should be done and around the world.
Good. Thank you for your question, Steve. This is very pertinent, particularly because it is at the core of the conversations that we just had in a virtual meeting of the Commission of Mountain Studies of the International Geographical Union. We were talking precisely on how the work of the Commission will emphasize the applicability of ontological principles all over. And we had participants from Africa. They are doing fantastic research. You know yourself in Ethiopia, you can definitely apply there the same kind of principles in the local systems. We have particularly a legacy from the work that many geologists have done in the Himalayas. That was actually collected by Bruno Messerli and Jack Ives in first generating this idea of this integrative science. I will tell you that one of the examples that comes to mind is the fact that we now have the sacred landscape of the Himalaya. We have now incorporated a brand new dimension of conservation that does not have to do anything with the water per se or the animals per se, but is this idea of the spiritual. And so just to demonstrate that it's not just in the Andes, we have also a lot of work done in Australia. The Aboriginals have actually made tremendous gains in the conquest of this new reality. They have obtained actually restitution of some not only cultural values, but also natural values. Remember that IS Rock is no longer IS Rock. The national park that is surrounded Uluru, Chata Yukta, is now considered to be a model of indigenous-based conservation practices. So I am positive on the fact that even though what I presented, because of my local expertise in the Andes, can definitely be applied elsewhere. Here in the Southeast United States, oftentimes I talk to my colleagues here in Georgia and in the neighboring states. We talk about the deep South. And the question comes there, how to define these things? And then I talk about Appalachianity, Appalachianness, and Appalachianitude. And that's something that called their attention. If possible, I will forward actually a brief report that the research office did at UGA, indicating how interesting is that notion that mountains are now conceived with this new front as socioecological landscapes. Definitely, maybe through Terry or Bonnie, I will circulate this link for you guys to peruse later. I hope I answered your question, Steve.
That would go ahead,
thanks
Stephen.
very much.
Yeah, that would be great to share that link. I don't see any hands up in case I'm missing something, so I'm going to jump in with a question, but please poke me if I'm missing
There's a chat
something here.
from Ramsey.
Okay, Ramsey. Or Ramsey, it doesn't matter actually. I'll ask your question first and then I'll go to mine. So Remzi's question, Fausto, is,
Yes.
I know maybe this is not your topic specifically, but given your expertise in a kind of more holistic mountain view, could you say a little bit about your insights on the impacts of increased lithium and other heavy metal mining in the Andes region?
Yes, of course, this is very polemic. I am a conservationist at heart, so I definitely have a very close attachment to the notion of do not overuse or do not abuse the resources on an area. Every time I have the opportunity to share with my Latin American colleagues, we realize that this is actually a two sides, double sword, so to speak, because there are good things for the local governments and bad things for the local municipalities. If you take the example of the lithium mines in the salares of the Altiplano, lithium mine is now bringing richness to the locals, to the state. In the past, those were abandoned areas. It was like a sea of salt that nothing could be done other than extracting small blocks manually for a subsistence kind of market for salt. Nowadays, the economy is blooming, and these areas that had not been considered productive in the past are now taken as the possible solution for the needs of revenue for those countries. I am not as curious for this heavy metal pollution that we are finding. A lot more difficult problem is when the mining companies, particularly in northern Chile and northern Argentina, are actually over-abusing the phreatic water. The underground aquifers that are located in these areas are being used in order to wash the copper ore or the gold ore. And of course, that water is being just wasted. It's fossil water. And how in an area that requires water for other things, the government of Chile, in his capitalistic outreach, has given the ownership of water to these companies. The water that is being taken from these underground aquifers, this fossil water, is now fueling the production of avocados from Chile to be sold around the world, particularly to the Chinese market. You know, there is a very interesting implication in our understanding of environmental interactions, in which everything we do and everything we have done in the past was to satisfy foreign markets in Europe, in the United States. Now, a lot of things that we are doing now in the region is to satisfy the markets in China. So we are witnessing the switching of hegemonic powers. And the reality is that the local people have very little power to do almost anything about that. So maybe Remzi, you may agree with me, the fact that, you know, heavy metal pollution is of course very bad. There may not be any other option for the economy in the macro scale for these areas, but in reality, there are other environmental problems that have far greater consequences than the open salt mine exploitations.
Thank you, Fausto. I'm going to jump in with a question that follows up both on that answer and also your properties of a new conservation or the new frontier for conservation that you were suggesting in the context of ontology. And so I just wanted to ask you to speak to whether it's your Andes example or beyond. Two things seem true in that new vision. One is that, you know, sort of the landscapes and mountainscapes as very animated spaces, and in other parts of your slides referred to as sacred spaces. I worry sometimes that places an enormous burden for conservation on indigenous populations. We know already that 40% of protected areas are in tenure held or land-based and indigenous populations. So how do you think about that problem? I mean, in our worst nightmare, it becomes a new form of sort of green colonialism. So how do we sort of avoid that pathway? And
allow me to use the example of Chile to illustrate this predicament. There was a millionaire from the United States who had the money to buy tremendous extent of land in the Bio region in Chile. Most Mapuche indigenous people who live in the area were really very afraid. And the nationalistic venue of people thinking that this millionaire from the United States will come and take their land and so on and so forth. A lot of debate, a lot of discussions, until the work that this American came to do on the ground was valuable. And the local Mapuche indigenous communities realized that it was not as bad as they expected. After his death, actually, his wife made the realization that it would be better for the indigenous people to be in a national park. So this huge private reserve, the largest private reserve at the time in the world, had been given as a gift to the government of Chile. And the government of Chile had implemented measures to actually take that Pumapungo Park and manage with the co-management of the indigenous. So that example could actually bring out this notion between how in the United States we take these two sides. One, with Conservation International, allowing for this idea of more kind of theoretical conservation, protection of animals and plants and people, versus the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy approach is actually to go there and buy the land. So Nature Conservancy have now been converted into one of the largest landowners. And that is precisely because of property rights in this country is sacred. So if you buy the land, you can do whatever. And because of Nature Conservancy decided to not to cut a tree, not to kill an animal, these private reserves are deemed so successful. They belong to the Nature Conservancy. And so in Latin America, and I'm not familiar with the Canadian reality, but oftentimes the members of the fourth world are not integrated into the governmental decisions of the management of national parks and protected areas. They live in their reservations, period. And whatever they do in the reservations is their business. And so, particularly in Colombia, for instance, when we have an implementation of indigenous territories, a big struggle was presented when the government didn't want to give them the ownership of these ancestral territories. A lot of people suffered. There were violence and so forth. So after decades, the government of Colombia finally allowed for the recognition that those ancestral territories belong to them. And yet the administration of the resources within these indigenous territories still depend upon the local, the provincial and the national government. So I think there is a little bit of confusion there, because even though we tend to think that indigenous people are really protecting their territories, once they are given the property rights of the land that they are occupying, the title allows them to come into the marketplace. And we have seen that in Ecuador, when you have given actually the title of the land to a group of Shuar Indians or indigenous people near to the Sangay volcano, these Shuar communities morphed completely from being jungle-like habitats to be cattle ranchers. And if you now go to southeastern Ecuador, you see the forest destroyed, a lot of pasture lands with some small remnants of forest. And that is actually an indigenous territory. So we have examples of both sides. In my case, when I was director of the National Museum of Natural History in Ecuador, we had the opportunity to talk to the chief of the Waorani people. At the time, the Waorani was actually confronting a very vigorous attack from the oil companies that wanted to go to the Yasuni National Park to perforate searching for oil. The chief of the Waorani came to the capital, and we have a huge meeting with scientists and other conservation leaders. And we asked this person directly, okay, what do you want us to do? And he asked us to give them a hospital, and he needed some chainsaw. And that is a request from the chief of the Waorani. For us, it was shocking. It made us realize that somehow living in the city, away from the implications of the poverty of the rural area, we were fantasizing on the fact that the indigenous people are really the exemplary conservationists, and that was not the case. So we had to be very careful there. In geography, we have learned through the ages that everything has to be situated. It's very difficult to generalize. There are successful examples. There are very bad examples as well. So with the situated analysis of specific case studies, we could come up with some better answer for you, Terry.
Yeah, I understand it's a complicated question, but it is that heart of the matter where conservation has expectations with regard to one part of the world's population and not the rest, with regard to conservation, that makes me nervous. And your spectrum of examples, I think, speaks to that. But I just don't want a future conservation to, be dependent on, the West's ideas, romantic ideas about the rest, and poverty and other things consider. And I'm not laying that on your desk, Fausto, to answer. It's just always something that, haunts me with some conversations about new conservation frontiers in general, not just
let me add a small reflection. Since we are living the COVID-19 era, because international travel have plummeted, there's no tourism. And if you go by the Amazon region, for instance, in many countries, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, these communities that were reliant on ecotourism exercises have collapsed. Yes. There's no tourism at all. And so they are now poorer than when they were actually initiating these ecotourism activities.
Yeah.
The fact that people have not been able to keep that particular reserve so the tourists can see the forest, they are now forced to go ahead and chop that down, because there's no other way for them to make a buck but to sell the timber. And this is reality. It's very tragic, but we definitely have to realize that we need to find an economic solution to the predicament of using resources. Yeah. One of the suggested areas is actually to subsidize the economies of these poor countries in the global south. Remember that we are living now in the Trustafarian era. Trustafarianism is present. If not, just look at how many young Americans take a leap year when they graduate from the university, and they do nothing but travel the world because they have the money to spend. They don't need to work. Mm-hmm. Every month, a check will come from the interest of a trust fund generated somewhere. And so they are living their lives without the need of doing anything. And so most cases, and this, by the way, has been actually observed in the Vatican, the conversations that Pope Francisco now has had to solve the predicament of underdevelopment, is to develop this Trustafarianism, how the global north could actually subsidize the global south to bring about kind of a more equal understanding of nature. That's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And we certainly have that conversation here too, in reference to that phenomena, but also more broadly in reference to reparations for colonial periods and so on. But
Yes.
I realize we are out of time, unfortunately. I hope I haven't missed anybody's hands. I've tried to watch chat and screens and I'm not seeing anything, but please join me in thanking Fausto for his virtual visit here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And I'll just let you linger on the screen and see all the hands go up clapping, and thank you again, Fausto. I'll be in touch.
All right.
Greetings from Moscow. How are you?
Oh, Yuri.
Yeah, hello.
One of my
It's wonderful to see all of you from Vancouver, from UBC up to the Georgia and around the world. It's fantastic opportunity. And may I have 1 minute to use 1 minute for one question? Fausto, you remember that this year is a year when we celebrate the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Program.
Correct.
50 years. And just now I complete editing the book about this jubilee. And Jack Ives was so kind to write a great big article where he made analysis from history and evolution of Man and Biosphere 6 mountain project, from ecology up to montology, and in which he finally cited your last manifesto for montology.
Oh, great.
And I would like to wish you all this very interesting approach. I know this rather well. I remember Bob Rhodes, our dear friend, the development. It's a new horizons and opportunities, how to integrate this approach, transdisciplinary approach, in the theme of integration for management, governance. That's a very great challenge in these times, particularly in the COVID times. Maybe the process will be turned out on the other side. Out migration will be from big cities to remote mountains. To have a refuge there from this situation, we have this very dangerous risk situation in the big cities. So that's finally, I would like to say hello to all of you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yuri.
Hello to you, Leonid,
Thanks a lot.
great to listen in on
yeah.
that conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the best regards from Moscow also.
Okay.
And we have many questions, of course, about mountains and about the Caucasus.
Mhm.
And of course, we invite you to the Caucasus because it is also very, very interesting mountain area with very interesting nature, ethnic groups and problems and so on. And of course, about green economy, it is also very interesting, and maybe it is difficult to solve this problem in the mountains.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very
For
much.
sure. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Fausto.
Thanks again.
We're going to get kicked off Zoom here in a
Fausto.
minute. So without letting that happen, let us just wave and thank you again.
All right.
Gracias,
Thank you.
Fausto. Gracias.
Muy bien, gracias a ustedes. Un placer.
Gracias.
Wow.